Welcome to the Futures Forum Live online, where we explore the landscape and byways of our shared futures. On this edition of the Futures Forum Live, we exchange ideas, information, education, and inspiration about the future of Black America. For more information, visit www.thefuturesforum.org. Get Futures Sense now. Share this story and share our future. Stay tuned for a journey to the future with host Dr. Claire Nelson.
Greetings and welcome to another edition of the Futures Forum Live, an online e-zine of the Futures Forum. February is Black History Month, and so we're having a conversation on the future history of Black America. Specifically, I wanted to examine just what life might be like for people of African descent living in these United States of America in the year 2030 and beyond. I'm very pleased on this segment. We will have with us Reverend Leslie Watts Malachi. Reverend Leslie, as we fondly call her, is director of the African American Religious Affairs at the People for the American Way and People for the American Way Foundation. She has been organizing and working with over 2,200 women and men from various Christian traditions across the country, as she tries to bring a strong association of progressive clergy, theologians, seminarians, and ministry lay leaders who can encourage African American churches and communities to become more civically engaged and promote social justice programs and policies. She's been featured in NBC, Cosmo, HuffPost. Prior to that, she was at National Rainbow Push Coalition. So she really has a good history of working across different perspectives of the social justice agenda. And I, in full disclosure, must say I've met her and worked with her as a member of a network of women called Vashti, and that might come up in the conversation. But without further ado, let's welcome and greet my friend, my colleague, Reverend Leslie Watts Malachi. Greetings, Rev Les. How are you?
Thank you, and greetings to you also, Dr. Claire. How are you today?
I'm fine, and as I would like to say right now, I don't know because of the full moon or something, but I'm feeling blessed and highly favored. You know, I have been, you know me, you've heard me comment at different women's events and other progressive conversation circles we've had, and sometimes I end up on the right side of the room and sometimes on the extreme left side of the room. I'm truly one of those independent thinkers. And this conversation I decided to have because I've really been struggling with this, what I'm calling our reactionary mode in which we as a Black community in America find ourselves. And I know that the faith community is a critical part of the construction of the sort of the undergirding or undergridding of what the future looks like. It's not just something that occurs by policy. I do believe history has shown that the faith community has always had a vision for not just a paradise in the hereafter, but what, like, say, a paradise in this lifetime might look like for a community of formerly oppressed peoples. So with that in mind, I want to start off by saying, you know that 2030 is about the UN agenda, is about the Sustainable Development Goals, and they have 169 targets, 17 goals, of which equality or inequality is one. And I want to start there by saying, when you think about poverty in this country, and you think about access to justice, and you think about inequality, what are you thinking the next 12 years could shape up to be, given the current climate?
That's a very interesting question, and I have to pause. I have to say that in my pause, it is I'm having some challenges dealing with the present climate, and you want to go 12. You want to go, 12 years into the future. And initially when you hear 2030, it does sound like it's a long way off, but it really isn't. We are just talking about 12 years. So my concern, or the thing behind my thinking right now, is that the children that are growing up today, the children that are in their teens today, will be in the workforce, in the leadership come 2030. What they are seeing, experiencing personally, when they look at what's happening, whether they're watching television, looking at what across the board, what's happening, not just in this country, but around the world. What I believe 2030 is going to look like. We're going to have more technology. We're going to have more things to access than before. But the heart and the hearts and the minds of our people, the hearts and the minds of people in this country, it's not going to change that much. Those that are currently, whether they're the white supremacists, the alt-right, those that are involved in the oppression that we're facing today, still today in the 21st century, those individuals are the parents, the grandparents, the ones that are sitting at the dinner table or lounging around, and they're the ones putting the thoughts of separation, the thoughts of oppression, the thoughts of us being better than them. They're the ones that are planting those kind of seeds where there will be a reaping of that for that generation. Again, those young people who are in their teens now, they're still going to grow, and they're going to grow up thinking in the same kind of way that we see the manifestation of again racism, and how that folds out when it comes to justice. When it comes to justice for that other group is just us, and it does not include the rest of the people. It doesn't include people who look like me or you. So that vision for the future really is, and you know this, Dr. Claire, it's historical. All along the way, you've always had, from the Middle Passage forward, the persons that were members of the families that owned slaves or enslaved persons. Their legacy was to move it forward to the next generation and the next generation. Yeah. What we see right now is something that's going to be moved forward to the next generation.
But let me ask you, the faith community, certainly from a Jamaican perspective, a lot of the slave rebellions in Jamaica were started by people in the Baptist community. In fact, two of our national heroes, Sam Sharp, who was executed, and Paul Bogle, who was executed for leading rebellions, today are national heroes, and they use the pulpit of the church to paint a different picture of the future. And I'm wondering is, if the church today is really actively looking out at that future, looking at the emerging challenges, whether it be more technology, therefore less access to certain jobs, looking at the assets that they do have and saying, you know what, this time, rather than just marching, we're going to be actually preparing the ground for surviving and thriving in a different way and finding new partnerships where they do exist to build that. Is the church looking at that? What is happening in the Black church and the social and economic justice movement?
Well, yes, the church is doing that right now, and I'm going to qualify the church, and I'm going to, my experience in over 30 years has been very specifically with African-American churches, the historical Black churches, if you will, the AME, the African Methodist Episcopal, African Methodist Episcopal Zion, the National Baptist Convention USA, National Baptist Convention Inc., National Primitive Baptist, Progressive National Baptist, Christian Methodist Episcopal, and then as late you've had the inclusion of, for example, Full Gospel. When we talk about specifically from my vantage point, talking about the Black church has always been the institution where, if you will, the seeds are planted. I don't know why I'm on this seed and harvest thing right now, but I have no idea what that's about, but the seeds get planted there. Mm-hmm. And when you see the seeds of justice, when you see the seeds of how you recognize inequality that's not always right in your face, the seed of recognizing that we as a people still have so much further to go, that we are caught up in the individualism that is that is so prevalent in this country. The church the churches that I work with, the churches, the preachers, the pastors, the minister leaders that I am aware of, yes, they are planting the seeds in their sermons. They are making the connections through Bible study of how we need to view Jesus Christ as a social justice activist. Yes, he's the Savior. Yes, he is our Lord. He is many, many names, but one of the names to be added to that list is that he is an activist. He was an organizer. He was actively involved in, again, setting the captives free, if you will. And so when we talk about economic development, when you talk about social justice, when you talk about civic engagement, those things are happening. Now, the difference is you don't see them being televised. If you're looking for CNN, if you're looking at MSNBC, even if you're looking at Fox News, you will not see the men and women that I work with that have been planting the seeds, they've been reaping the harvest, they have committed their entire life to civil rights, social justice, and now even moving to that further. What I like about human rights is that it can't be legislated. That's the problem that I have with civil rights in this country. It depends upon what political party is in office. But they are doing the work for economic justice. They are holding the job fairs. They are showing people how to develop, how to create a resume. What is it that needs to be said in an interview? They are working with young people. They are working with some who some might call functioning illiterate, folks who get along from day to day, and they can understand and see the basic language, but beyond that, they may have a challenge with reading and comprehension. I see, the food banks. I see all of this, the wealth of what the church can do with the men and women that I work with. And so yes.
My question is, as I am hearing you, one of the things that struck me, I wanted to jump in, but I didn't want to cut you off, was this idea you're not seeing them on CNN and Fox. But my question then becomes, we still have a black media. We still have a black, quote unquote, television media. We still have black-owned radio stations. We still have black-owned newspapers. Why then why are they not using that? Why is there not a more intentional, or how can we see a more intentional use of those spaces to get more people to be aware of what's possible and to begin to focus and replicate on those experiments that are indeed happening to create a better life, economically in terms of jobs or creating your own micro business? How is it we're not seeing that happening?
Well, a couple of things in that question. One is, there are many of these churches that have their own radio stations or programs or television stations. And so what you see is what's happening at a local level. So you don't see, you won't see those things nationally. Okay. So what we see, what is said and what is heard takes place. It's a local, it's right there within that immediate sphere of influence.
Gotcha.
For them. And so the second part is for the national black media, they are like regular media, well, I don't mean but so-called mainstream media. They have a competition for viewers there, and quite often, my experience has been, my knowledge base is that we as a people don't necessarily look to and look for that kind of information to come through black media. One of the places,
I'm being honest too. May I say one thing also, we also tend to focus on the things that are headline grabbing.
But that's part of it. Yes, and I was going to say that part of the national media where information goes out, but it goes out, it's filtered in such a way that I'm always concerned about the long-term impact as opposed to the short-term, is what happens with like the radio talk show hosts, the morning shows are, those are still a wonderful way of getting information out, but sometimes that gets mixed in with a little bit of comedy, with a little bit of with some other flavoring that can dilute the importance of the issues and concerns.
Although we have to say, and I have to say this because I have noticed it's something that is prevalent, maybe because we just have to laugh. In Jamaica, we have a saying, if you don't laugh, you will cry. So we tend to find comedy in them was very
Yeah.
serious. It's a very black thing. I've noticed this. Only Caribbean people do it. I know the African Americans do it too. They've been a very fraught moment, and someone would bust a joke because it's the way of breaking that tension and the pressure of having to face that reality. So
Right.
as I hear you talk then about the fact that the church is trying to do some things and trying to make that space, how are we then, this being an election year and all, tying this idea that, okay, and certainly someone like yourself who's been in the trenches for over 28 years, you are now beginning to say, okay, at the end of the day, what's going to be different? I want to be able to say, as a result of X and my doing this, this actually emerged, right? So what then are you seeing as the new way forward in this next 2 years, it'll be election year, next year, between now and 2020? How are the ways your organization might have Black church posture differently or organized differently to really be intentional about some number of gap that you say we're going to work on this. Let's say, for example, you have to pick 3 things. What would they be, and how would you begin to shape that?
Well, we've started that agenda for 2020. I'd like to say that we actually started putting things in place around really in 2010. And one of the couple of things is, in terms of issues, it's definitely looking at economic development. But economic development cannot happen unless we have restoration of voting rights for formerly incarcerated persons, because you're looking at 3 to 5 million men and women who are no longer on paper, if you will, who cannot fully participate as citizens in this country. If you can't participate and you have no ownership of what's going on, then what ends up happening? You sit on the sidelines, right? You say that this is not about me. So encouraging, getting our men and women who have been in prison over a period of time for whatever reason, getting them the kind of training that they need, the kind of exposure, the kind of awareness of the need for them to be included in the community for the development to occur. That's one thing that's very important. Economic development and strengthening also. So it's about the strengthening the capacity of those that have been marginalized in our community. So the other part of that is protecting our rights. Our rights are always on somebody's table to chip away at, to carve out, and that is something that that has to be stopped. One of the things that we look at is the courts. What are we doing to make sure that particularly our federal courts are strong, that when we talk about justice, that we don't have to question what that means to someone who has a lifetime appointment and is sitting on a bench? We should never have had in 2015 the kind of what's the word that I like to use? Just the gutting of the Civil Rights Act in the way in which the decision of Alabama versus Eric Holder, what happened with that should never have taken place. That is the reason. So looking at the courts, looking at how the courts shape, looking at everything from affirmative action to workplace safety, to workplace discrimination against persons, that all feeds into economics. And then I would say, looking at our families, how our families see each other. Families are defined differently nowadays. And what we have to understand is that if you are the baby boomer generation or the traditional generation that came before then, defining a family meant a husband, meant a wife as in female wife, husband as in male, children, and maybe a dog or a cat and a car in the garage. That was family. That's not family anymore today. Today, families are mixed. They're multicultural. They're multiracial, racial, ethnic, even of different faith traditions. People are getting together or hooking up, as you will, and defining themselves as a unit, as a family in the way that is comfortable for them. And so for us to move forward now, moving to 2020 and moving toward 2030, it is to understand that economically We have to move people again who are marginalized. We've got to be stronger, and be, if you will, as we say if the Bible teaches us, to be not borrowers but lenders, to be less about consumers and more consuming products that end up giving money to persons who end up funding our own oppression, and be those who have money in the bank, so that if an emergency comes up, we got it covered. Yes. We've got to connect everything nowadays. The lens that I'm looking at now, Dr. Claire, it's all connecting back to economic development. The way this country is being ran right now, look at who is in positions of influence, if you will, in government. Look at what's happening, whether it's state government, federal government. It's people who have money or access to money. And go ahead.
Yeah, but don't we find, for example, though, if we look at, say, who is in government, let's come back to economic. When we look at the Sustainable Development Goals, actually, Jeffrey Sachs came up with a group of 7 goals, and he's, I think, has formed a small NGO trying to get the word out. I'm sure he probably needs much more help and needs to figure out what he's doing. And one of the things he hasn't done is put any Black people on his board. I found that very interesting and strange. But that apart, he does have some really interesting ways of measuring what he thinks America ought to do. Very progressive, 100% of children in Child Start, 100% of children being able to access tertiary education, be it skill-based or college, 100% of healthcare, affordable healthcare. So these are some goals he thinks America ought to get at. So as I'm looking at this, like a thought experiment I have in my head, what could happen? And you tell me from the future of the American dream, what could happen, let's say, if by 2020 we had maybe 5 to 10 church communities, pick communities, small communities, and say, look, we're going to run experiments in parallel by finding partners who would fund us, or self-funding what we can, and finding partners who would fund us to really put an intentional program of having people design this future, right? And working towards the 3 top things, which might be education, micro enterprise, and healthcare as the 3, let's say, legs of the stool. Do you think this is something that, which I think of every day, maybe I'm kind of crazy, but do you think it's something like the church as a whole, of the 22,000 people you're working with, is this something that could be done? Is it that I'm totally crazy? Or can we really set an intention and do an experiment and get support to move something like this forward?
Again, those types of things are happening, are moving forward. Those kinds of relationships and partnerships are in place already.
Okay.
I'd like to just say that again, that exists. It may not exist at the macro level that we probably, not probably, but that we need to see it happen at. So it moves beyond. So for example, to see more of the partnerships that are taking place with the denominations, for example, how are they partnering with corporations to move things forward? That is happening though at local levels. You do have pastors and congregations who are working with local banks with national banks that have with branches of banks, for example, to do everything from planting trees to making sure that there are scholarships available for young people who want to go to that trade, vocation, junior college, or to a 4-year university. So it is happening at the macro level. Hearing about it is one of the things that we need to do better, so that people recognize that the change is coming, that it's happening, that the institution that we still call our own, that is the Black church, is an integral part of that change, again, of economic development, of strengthening the family, of working with the marginalized, of meeting the goals that the goals that the faith community has established, or that was established through our Lord and Savior for those of us who are Christians. That is happening. But in talking to you, the note that I need to make, and anyone else who is involved in in this kind of work, working with faith-based institutions, working with churches, is we've got to do a better job of communicating what is happening, communicating those types of partnerships. We do have in Michigan, where we've got pastors that are working with the government, for example, in Flint, where my family is dealing with the water crisis, that they are working together to bring in, to get jobs, to do job training, to make sure that the resurrection of Flint, because there will be a resurrection, that you will be able to say that it was inclusive of all people, that it was inclusive of our folks. In New York, for example, we have it's called Impact, and they are a group of pastors who work specifically with the city government and in terms of how it distributes contracts and how those contracts go out and how they inform and include African Americans, whether it's the workforce, whether it's as vendors, that is happening. So, so there are lots of things like that that's going on in Aiken, South Carolina, where you're working with the EPA to deal with the environmental justice issue, where you have the nuclear plants that are there. So again, there are some things happening, but what you have just convicted me to do is to figure out a way, and that going back to where you were earlier with the Black media, we've got to connect more with Black media to share these kind of best practice examples. That's what needs to happen.
Because from my perspective, I'm only seeing what I consider the everlasting march, and everlasting march is very fatiguing, because what's the point if you can't do anything other than march? Because to some extent, it's nice media, it's nice, theater, but at the end of the day, if you're working in a situation where you're not in control of the levers to change that, or the people don't really care if you march or not, then
that's right.
You better be doing something other than marching. So as we begin to wrap up, moving forward, would you say, well, I mean, as a Christian, I would presume that you're optimistic, but I'm going to ask you, are you optimistic, pessimistic, or neutralistic about the future? And why do you hold whatever feeling you have? So I'm going to say, I guess you're optimistic, right?
I am optimistic. So, I will affirm that.
Why?
Why? Because of the lessons from the past. Why? Because of what we know from the history of our people in this country. The movement forward had always required sacrifice. There was pain. There was opportunity for celebration, but the celebration would be short, because we have to start all over again with the, with the pain of growing, of being there. It's because of hope that I am optimistic, that I know that in some way or another that everything is going to work out for our good, and it has. And when I think about why I'm optimistic, again, there has not been a decade that has passed that we as a people have not made at least one step forward. Gotcha. That we have not seen. I mean, we can talk about this decade, this decade where we had the last two, where we had an African-American president, right? Back in the 80s, the step forward was when we had the number of mayors that were elected to Black mayors that were elected to major cities. When we think about moving forward, when we think about how in the 90s that we addressed the issue of HIV and AIDS that was happening in our community. At every decade, there's an opportunity, there's something that moves forward, there's something that somebody ends up saying, I didn't know if I was going to live long enough to ever see this, right?
So I'm going to ask you right now then, 2020 to 2030, and by the way, what does Believe 828 stand for? The decade of 2020 to 2030, what are you looking to see?
This may sound weird. I'm looking to see the manifestation of love. Love in the workplace, love on the street corner, love in the boardroom. I would like to see, because what that means is a removal of the negative. That's being very hopeful and optimistic, again, because as I said earlier, the people who will be running things come 2030 are sitting at the tables with some of those who are running or think they're running right now, and they're spewing racism, they're spewing homophobia, Islamophobia, anti-immigrant, that's there. But I do believe that there is going to be that kind of change, that hope is what's going to drive it, and love has to be at the table, because when you've got love is for the betterment of people. Love is light that shines in darkness. And believe in 8:28, what that means is, I believe in specifically Romans 8:28 in the New Testament, and it says basically that all things work together for good for those who love the Lord and who are called for his purpose. And we as a people have been called. There's no way that anybody should think that the things that we go through are just by coincidence, the good, the bad, and the ugly, because we always have to remember that God made the good days, but he also made the not so good days, so that we can learn and we can grow. My desire is to see the manifestation of love, of loving thy neighbor in such a way that when I love my neighbor, I want to help my neighbor. I want to be there for my neighbor. I want to feel good when my neighbor advances in whatever it is, when they're celebrating something. I want to see more love coming into that next decade.
Well, I think that's a very good place to end this conversation. Bob Marley would with Bob Marley, the fact that Bob Marley's song One Love was chosen as the anthem, I always find it fascinating that a little Rasta man from Jamaica, his music could have had a kind of global impact.
That's right.
But we hear more and more this call for love, and I really want to thank you for putting that in a conversation that typically doesn't come up, because typically when we're talking about these very intellectual conversations or would-be intellectual conversations, I try not to be too intellectual about it. We get caught up in the words and lose the meanings behind it. And the fact that at the end of the day, as we trying to construct a more just society and one that works for more people, at the end of the day, it has to start to some extent, not by the law, but by the ethics and the morality of each individual. And some of that comes strictly out of people being able to love the other as they love themselves. So thank you so much, Reverend Malachi Watson, for putting that on the table.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.
So my friends, we have come to the end of another great conversation. We were just speaking to Reverend Leslie Malachi Watson, who is the Director of African American Religious Affairs at the People for the American Way and the People for the American Way Foundation. I want to thank you so much for joining us on Futures Forum Live, where we explore salient ideas to help us create sustainable, thriving futures. And please do remember, it's better to be the parent of the future as opposed to being the child of the past. Go out and seize your future. Safe journey.
You have been listening to the Futures Forum Live online. This podcast aims to tell and share stories about the emerging future and help us better shape the future we want. The Futures Forum Live online is a production of the Futures Forum in Washington, D.C. For more information, visit www.thefuturesforum.org. Get future sense now. Remember, our future is embedded in the landscape of the present. Share this story and share the future.